Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in today. My name is Dan Giddis. I am the director of our Threat Intelligence and Detection Engineering team, or TIDE team here at UltraViolet. No surprises based on the title, but our topic today is Iranian cyber threats, specifically some of the prominent threat actors you may or may not have heard of, and how Iranian cyber operations can directly and indirectly impact your organization. I do want to let you all know, if you didn't hear the little disclaimer, this is a recorded session. So if for any reason you're uncomfortable with that, I'd ask that you drop now. I also want to call out that this is the first of our new monthly threat webinars, so be on the lookout for details for our next session. We can go to the next slide. Here's our agenda for today. We'll start with a quick overview of the TIDE team, followed by a brief discussion on the cyber implications of global conflicts. From there, we'll move into various Iranian threat actors and their diverse motives, third-party concerns, and finish with an overview of what this all means, what UltraViolet is doing, and what your organization can do. And I will ask, we do have a question and answer session, so I would just ask that because there's only one of me, you please save any questions for the end. TIDE is UltraViolet's dedicated threat intel and detection engineering team, as our name suggests. We're responsible for ingesting and analyzing cyber threat intel, or CTI, that supports our detection engineering capabilities and enables hypothesis-driven and IOC-driven threat hunting. We also provide our clients and SOC teams with timely, relevant CTI reports that include a summary of the threat, our own analysis on the threat, insight as to why the threat matters, numerous recommendations, and an overview of UltraViolet response measures. We're also more than happy to meet with UltraViolet customers, provide CTI and detection insight, and regularly support offensive security engagements by informing exercises with the latest threat intel, including involving threat actor TTPs. Internally, we also tune existing detections to ensure they're accurately responding to the latest threats. And again, we support our SOC and account teams with their various objectives. Next slide. All right, so I'd imagine this is the reason that most of you all are here. So this really shouldn't come as a surprise, but we live in a world where conflicts are largely or sometimes entirely handled in cyberspace. Physical military strikes and general geopolitical hostilities often are either accompanied by or trigger retaliatory cyber attacks, at times before or in concurrence with physical attacks. This can come through state-sponsored actors. The best example may be the slew of Russian state-sponsored cyber operations that have targeted Ukrainian infrastructure before and during the full-fledged invasion in 2022. And independent, state-aligned, or state-sympathetic actors, commonly referred to as hacktivists. Just as critical infrastructure is often a target for military strikes, it often serves as a primary target for cyber threat actors, either through disruptive or destructive attacks or via intelligence gathering operations that often support future retaliatory attacks. Cyber attacks also provide a vector for countries with less sophisticated militaries to respond. For example, Iran doesn't possess the military capabilities to strike out-of-region U.S. targets, but they do have the resources to engage in global cyber attacks. Finally, physical hostilities really open the floodgates for more aggressive, disruptive cyber operations. What do I mean by this? In peacetime, or even, say, tense times, the potential for retaliation, be it through physical conflict or disruptive cyber attacks, serves as a deterrent for offensive, disruptive cyber operations. When physical conflict starts, however, there's not as much for countries to lose if they were to launch disruptive attacks. Suddenly, we find ourselves in a situation where such attacks, typically off the table during peacetime, are now very much on the table. Next slide. The most commonly associated thought with state-sponsored cyber threats is espionage. But over the last handful of years, security teams have linked numerous hacktivist groups and personas to state-sponsored operatives. If you're not familiar with the term hacktivism, it refers to malicious cyber activity designed to promote or support an ideology, belief, political movement, and/or a social movement. Hacktivist attacks are typically shorter duration and less sophisticated than state-sponsored operations or cybercrime operations like ransomware attacks and info-stealer infections. These attacks typically take the form of website defacements, denial of service attacks, or hack and leak operations, although some hacktivists have previously resorted to ransomware or wiper malware. As far as targets, hacktivists typically target symbolic organizations or software to spread a message and stoke fear. The image on the right, for example, is from a 2023 Iranian hacktivist defacement attack that targeted Unitronics PLCs. This attack occurred during the 2023 Israel-Hamas conflict, and Unitronics is an Israeli company. You can see from the image that these devices were targeted due to their ties to Israel. Now, like I just mentioned, we're increasingly seeing evidence pointing to state-sponsored operatives being embedded in hacktivism. What's not immediately clear is how much of this is at state direction as opposed to a side project, if you will. Regardless, in recent years, there have been two key Iran-linked actors of this nature that have emerged. Cyber Avengers, responsible for the Unitronics attack shown on this slide, and Handela. Before we cover these groups in more detail, I do want to acknowledge Iran's lengthier history of hacktivist ties. There were a couple notable events in 2012. First was Operation Ababil, which was a series of DDoS attacks against U.S. banks linked to Iranian threat actors. These attacks were in response to U.S. sanctions against Iran. And second was the Shamoon attack, in which Iranian hacktivists self-named the cutting-edge sword of justice deployed a wiper against 30,000 Saudi Aramco devices. The attack occurred in response to Saudi policies and a destructive attack against Iran's oil ministry. Actors deployed modified versions of the malware in 2016 and 2018 against energy organizations in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And we'll see in the next few minutes, this shows a notable consistency in tactics and objectives from these actors over the last 14 years. So we'll start with a high-level overview of these actors before moving into a more in-depth look at their TTPs and possible impact. Cyber Avengers on the left, who you may also hear teams across the industry refer to as Hydro Kitten, Storm 0784, UNC 5691, Soldiers of Solomon, and more, has been attributed to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. This is a state-sponsored threat group, and their operations tend to focus on disruption, typically via defacement attacks. We covered the 2023 defacement attack, and CISA reported they were conducting similar attacks against Rockwell Automation Allen Bradley PLCs earlier this month. Handela, on the other hand, is a persona tied to the Iranian state-sponsored APT known as Void Manicore or Banished Kitten. While this APT has been tied to Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security, or MOIS, it's not clear if Handela is operating at state direction or using their skills in an unofficial manner. Either way, Handela is a sophisticated actor known for disruptive and destructive attacks that typically involve hack and leak operations and at times wiper malware. They've conducted a number of attacks of this nature against organizations based in the US, Israel, and Albania. Next slide. Thank you. Our first in-depth look of the day will be at Cyber Avengers, and we've highlighted their observed TTPs on the right. This includes all of their known MITRE attack TTPs, as well as an additional highlight of techniques that can have substantial business impact. For Cyber Avengers, we're actually working with the MITRE ICS TTPs rather than Enterprise. Now, disclaimers aside, Cyber Avengers first emerged in September 2023 when they made a number of false or exaggerated claims of successful attacks against several Israeli targets. At that time, with the evidence available, Cyber Avengers appeared very much to be a hacktivist group. This belief continued through their Unitronics attack a couple of months later, which, by the way, they were assessed to have accessed those devices using default credentials, creating a painful reminder of the importance of never leaving default credentials in place on any device. Anyways, they continued to be labeled as a hacktivist group into 2024 until the US Treasury sanctioned the group and tied them to the IRGC, which implicated them as state-backed actors rather than an unaffiliated hacktivist group. CISA reaffirmed this attribution in a December 2024 advisory, as well as their advisory at the start of this month. Now, the big question that always needs to be answered in threat intelligence is, so what? This info is great on its own, right? But why does it matter? Well, the theme throughout today is going to be the business impact, and in the case of the Cyber Avengers attacks, the unavailability of PLCs and HMIs has caused denial of service environments, communications failures, and a general inability to operate the HMI, all leading to a pause in business operations and possible financial loss as a result. It's important to note that your organization would feel this impact as a result of a direct attack, obviously, but it could also occur through attacks against third parties or vendors. Simply put, imagine any one of your vendors, what would happen if they were completely or partially inoperable for a few days. Now, transitioning to Handela, they were similarly believed to be a hacktivist actor until evidence uncovered ties to Void Manicore. The current understanding of Handela is they are an online persona directly operated by Void Manicore, meaning this is a state-sponsored operation supporting disruptive and destructive objectives. Void Manicore is also known to operate the Homeland Justice persona, which is another hacktivist operation that has been active since 2021. Homeland Justice is known for their July 2022 ransomware, wiper, and leak attacks against the Albanian government, which were carried out in response to Albania hosting the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, or MEK. It's an exiled Iranian opposition group. Homeland Justice is assessed to have gained initial access over a year, 14 months to be exact, before the destructive attacks. Handle follows a similar playbook, stealing credentials and abusing VPN accounts to gain access long before any destructive activity occurs, which indicates the group places significant emphasis on stealth, persistence, and strong operational security, leading to well-planned attacks rather than quick hits or smash and grab style operations. Next slide. Many, although not all, Handle attacks culminate in wipers, maximizing the damage felt by their victims. Their long idle activity may ramp back up in the hours prior to deploying a wiper to ensure they still have the necessary access. The damage from wipers is straightforward and severe. Data that is not backed up may be lost forever, and business recovery time can be substantial, resulting in long-term disruptions and financial loss. While not as destructive, their hack and leak operations can have a significant business impact as well. These attacks are also capable of halting business operations and can jeopardize a significant volume of data. If this data falls into the wrong hands, it can compromise employee PII, that's personally identifiable information, or lead to follow-on activity. Of course, the name and shame nature also brings negative media attention. All of this demonstrates Iranian destructive cyber capabilities, and as we discussed earlier, highlights how governments can and do resort to destructive cyber operations in response to military operations, sanctions, and other perceived hostilities. These attacks will almost certainly remain on the table for the Iranian government moving forward, and we'd expect to see them occur if the conflict re-escalates. The impending ceasefire was just extended yesterday, but the latest reports from this morning are that Iran has captured at least 3 ships in the Strait of Hormuz. So this conflict and the ceasefire appear to be very up in the air, and it's hard to tell what exactly will come next. Next slide. So I put traditional in quotes here because when we think of state-sponsored threats across the board, as I said earlier, the motive we often jump to is espionage. And while this is the case, the majority of the time, various groups from Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, as we've seen today, prove that state motives expand well beyond espionage. But that's a different topic for another month. So back to our original subject, the Iranian government maintains a handful of advanced persistent threat, or APT groups, that operate primarily with espionage and intelligence gathering motives. 3 of these groups, APT-33, APT-35, and APT-42, have been attributed to the IRGC, while the 4th, known as Muddy Water, has been attributed to the MOIS. While the targets are diverse, we do see some consistencies. For example, all are known to target organizations based in the US, and 3 of the 4 have a history of targeting government and healthcare organizations. As we did with Cyber Avengers and Handela, we'll spend the next few minutes looking at each of these groups in depth and outlining the business impact of their operations. And again, I do just want to call out back to an earlier point. As we mentioned, while Iran may not have the military capabilities to physically strike the US, these groups demonstrate the cyber capabilities to do so. Next slide. We'll start with APT-33, who is also tracked across the industry as Refined Kitten, Elfin, Curious Serpents, Peach Sandstorm, and Newsbeef, because as you may know in this industry, we can never just keep it simple with one name. As you can see, I'm not the most creative person. That's why I'm in CTI. So we're sticking with the same format as with our previous threat groups. Jokes aside, APT-33 is known for large-scale initial access operations, typically in the form of either spear phishing, impersonating well-known organizations, or password spraying. They then triage, if you will, their successful compromises and proceed with follow-on activity against their most impactful victims. Impactful can be an ambiguous term, and the specific victim selected for follow-on operations is very likely determined by their key objective at the time. The early stages of their attacks focus heavily on reconnaissance and credential theft, followed by malware, often a backdoor for persistence in the latter stages. APT-33 maintains a decent malware arsenal, but they often leverage legitimate tools and living off the land techniques to hide their activity and evade detections. In recent years, APT-33 has increasingly targeted cloud tenants and to access and exfiltrate sensitive information from cloud environments. It's important to note that APT-33 does have a history of destructive attacks, including the Shamoon attacks that we discussed earlier, but this activity primarily occurred in the late 2010s. In modern times, APT-33 is primarily tasked with espionage objectives for the IRGC and the Iranian government. In terms of impact from APT-33 operations, long-term access and credential compromise is never good for data integrity. APT-33 has repeatedly demonstrated their ability to obtain and maintain access, then exfiltrate significant quantities of data, now from both on-prem and cloud environments. The Iranian government primarily uses any collected data and information to support their economic, military, and geopolitical objectives. Next slide. So just a quick example of APT33 infrastructure. This was part of a job application theme lore that ultimately led to the download of the false font backdoor. Now, on paper, this may look more like credential harvesting, but it's more likely actually an attempt to identify high-value targets based on the information that they fill out prior to deploying the backdoor. Next slide. Next up is APT35, also known as Magic Hound, Charming Kitten, Mint Sandstorm, TA453, and various other names. This group is known for their identity-focused social engineering, often targeting organizations or individuals with national security and geopolitical influence. These operations take the form of credential harvesting campaigns that target both personal and individual accounts. APT35 takes a patient approach, often impersonating relevant contexts such as journalists, academics, or conference organizers, and engaging with their targets for extended periods of time before engaging in any malicious activity. Once the malicious activity starts, it often coincides with login portals that spoof Google or Microsoft. These portals are designed to collect credentials and MFA tokens, resulting in account takeover. From here, APT35 focuses on email collection, credential reuse, persistence, including persistence on cloud accounts, and lateral movement. If they've accessed a particularly valuable account, the group may deploy a backdoor to ensure they have long-term access. Now, similar to APT33, the impact to APT35 operations is long-term access that compromises accounts, emails, and other sensitive information. Given the nature of their targets, a lot of this information can be sensitive to geopolitics or national security. This information can then be used, again, by the Iranian government for strategic decision-making and trying to gain a geopolitical advantage. Next slide. So these are a couple APT35 SMS phishing or smishing for short messages from June 2025 at the onset of the Israel-Iran conflict. Notably, these messages were assessed to be crafted with AI to help structure their layout and avoid any grammatical errors to help add a sense of legitimacy. Next slide. Our final IRGC link group is APT42. This group is operationally similar to APT35, leading to occasional misattribution, overlap, or assessments that they are a subgroup of APT35. However, UltraViolet and various other security firms consider the two groups to be distinct. Now, similar to APT35, APT42 focuses on long-term credential theft and account takeover, but they also engage in surveillance. These operations are designed to gain information on communications, sensitive data, and relationship information, which suggests an underlying counterintelligence objective. But we can see some of the larger operational similarity to APT35, exemplified by the phishing and credential harvesting, MFA token collection, and an emphasis on email access. In the case of APT42, the actors focus on email forwarding rules, data discovery, and account expansion rather than trying to move laterally to other accounts. And the targeted accounts aren't confined to enterprise accounts. APT42 will also attempt to gain access to personal email accounts that still contain relevant sensitive information without the hurdle of corporate security controls and vendors. The impact of APT42 operations is, again, similar to that of APT35, but the collection of personal information actually creates an interesting twist. This information allows for a more refined, realistic targeting, both of the original target and downstream targets of relevance. Once again, this information can give the Iranian government a strategic objective, while also allowing the IRGC to quietly surveil persons of interest. Next slide. These images show how APT42 operationalizes their work. At the top, we see a tweet from Lahav Harkov. She's an American-born Israeli journalist. It's possible that APT42 was simply spoofing her and targeting an existing list of users, or that they accessed her email based on what we know about them and sent spear phishing emails from an attacker-controlled account. On the bottom left is what appears to be a legitimate Twitter profile for someone named Mona Lori. However, Mandiant found this to be a cover account for a fake persona created by APT42. In March 2023, the group sent spear phishing emails from an account linked to this persona. The emails led to a fake Google Meet site, which prompted users to enter their credentials. Any credentials entered onto the site, which you can see on the right, and this site also happened to reference an APT42 domain in its HTML contents, were then transmitted back to the attackers. We can go to the next slide. Our last group of the day is Muddy Water, also known as Static Kitten, Mango Sandstorm, Seedworm, Earth Vitala, Boggy Serpens, and TA450. This group is linked to Iran's Ministry of Intelligence Security, MOIS, as we mentioned earlier, and they've been active in recent months. Now, just before the start of the U.S. military operations in Iran, Muddy Water targeted at least one bank, software company, airport, and NGO based in the U.S. with the DIN door and fake set backdoors. At this time, there's limited information on how the group achieved initial access in these attacks. However, historically, Muddy Water has favored high-volume, low-sophistication attacks, kind of like what we discussed with APT33. In recent years, however, they have pivoted to stealthier operations, including more tailored social engineering tools. And with that in mind, recent intel points to other methods for gaining initial access. In late January 2026, the group achieved initial access to an Israeli organization via RDP. Around the same time, they were reported to be engaged in spear phishing campaign targeting other organizations in the Middle East. This tells us a couple key things. One, Muddy Water has the resources to engage in multiple campaigns at once. And two, Muddy Water will actively leverage multiple initial access techniques rather than one tried and true method. Now, regardless of how they achieve initial access, post-compromise, Muddy Water typically abuses trusted relationships to gain control of legitimate internal accounts, then deploys malware for continued remote access. This long-term access allows them to collect sensitive information, including through screenshots, and exfiltrate collected data. A few important notes on Muddy Water. I just hinted at this, but they are believed to receive significant resources from the MOIS and Iranian government as a whole, and there's evidence that they will collaborate with other Iranian state-sponsored actors. Muddy Water has targeted a broad array of industries, primarily with an espionage motive, although they have previously posed as ransomware actors to engage in disruptive attacks. From the business perspective, their impact is similar to that of the other groups we've discussed. Long-term access allows for the exfiltration of a high volume of sensitive data, possibly strategic data, and their ability to compromise legitimate internal accounts can create a situation that is hard to identify and fully remediate. It also allows the threat actors to take over a high volume of accounts to strengthen their foothold in your network and possibly target vendors or third parties of interest. Next slide. Now, despite their resources, as you can see, there's nothing really crazy about this phishing email. There are a few elements that may make this effective. First, it's almost so generic that it may be overlooked as phishing. And two, they use cyber as a trust mechanism. So in other words, cybersecurity guidelines certainly wouldn't be phishing, right? And third, while simple words like new and phrases like please refer to are very inviting and speak to the curiosity of the recipient, they also entice them to take a look at this file even if there are red flags that exist. So again, sometimes simple measures from threat actors can be the most effective. Next slide. So as we come to the end of our session today, let's switch gears a little bit over to third-party concerns. The first and perhaps most obvious issue that comes to mind is supply chain threats. And this works in a couple of ways. First, attacks against other organizations, whether they are disruptive or not, can create business disruptions. The most immediate pain is going to be if one of your vendors suffers an attack. In this scenario, you may be experiencing shipping delays, communication disruptions, and maybe even price increases in the long term. These disruptions can be short-lived or they can be fairly lengthy depending on the type of attack and how complex it is. And if you have a critical vendor that is offline for a week or more, then your organization will almost certainly feel that impact. Perhaps less obvious is how attacks against your vendor's vendors or fourth-party organizations could impact you. So if your vendor relies on a critical component to provide a service to your organization, and that critical component is taken offline, then that could slow your vendor and therefore your organization further downstream. So we can actually use bread as an easy analogy here. If you own a restaurant, you likely rely on a bread vendor in some capacity. That bread vendor is going to rely on a wheat vendor to make their bread. If the wheat vendor suffers a ransomware attack and is taken offline, then they may be delayed in shipping wheat. Less wheat would equate to less bread production, and less bread production means less availability, or perhaps a more substantial price for your restaurant. The other side of a supply chain attack is possible access to your organization and your data. We've seen this over and over again, from SolarWinds to more recent North Korean linked supply chain attacks targeting NPM and Python packages. In these scenarios, threat actors compromise a vendor and then use the vendor's privileges to access your organization. There's some history here for Iranian threat actors, but not nearly as much as Russian or North Korean threat actors. Still, this is a viable threat that we should be aware of. The other third-party concern, which may have a little more relevance here, given Iranian actors' recurring interest in account takeovers and their use of the valid accounts technique, is the potential for third-party attacks to expose access credentials for your organization. Credential reuse is common and not going away, no matter how often we tell folks not to use the same password across accounts. So if you have employees that have accounts with third parties and those third parties suffer a data breach or other form of attack in which credentials are exposed, and there's a decent chance that those credentials are the same or similar to their enterprise or RDP credentials, for example, within your organization. And unfortunately, given this nature, this can extend beyond dedicated third parties. So we see credential reuse carry over from personal accounts, meaning that personal email, Netflix, streaming, banking, pretty much any personal account that you think of may have similar credentials to business accounts. These original leaks don't need to be the result of state-sponsored activity either. There are what really feels like an infinite number of credentials available on darknet markets and forums, thanks to ransomware leaks, info stealers, and more. This means a lot of the work is often done for state-sponsored actors ahead of time. You may be thinking that a lot of this seems like it's out of your control, and the unfortunate reality is that some of it is, but there are still steps that you and your organization can take. A lot of it starts with communication, and as a disclaimer, this goes both ways, meaning you help your vendors and ensure they help you. Ensure there is proactive communication with vendors over security and defense measures, and implement a process so that your third parties notify you immediately if they suffer an attack. This is extra relevant if the third party faces a data or credential leak, and it's extra relevant to have an alert system in place should they find that your organization's data or credentials are exposed. I'd also recommend, sorry, Kathleen, can we go back to that slide for just one more second? Thank you. I also recommend considering initiatives like joint tabletop exercises to ensure the security and communications measures that you have in place work effectively and don't just work on paper, and to ensure that any issues that come up in the event of a attack, or in this case, a hypothetical scenario, can be addressed. Also take the extra step to share intelligence, especially if that may pertain to a threat towards a third party of yours. And lastly, and this ties back to the credential issues we touched on above, ensure you are regularly rotating credentials and enabling MFA across all accounts. These are small but often overlooked steps, and a lack of either of these continues to account for a significant number of successful intrusions. Now we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So there was a lot of information today, and I do want to take a minute to ensure you all understand this matters. And again, this is the ever-critical so what element, as we call it in the Intel world. So at the start of today's session, we discussed Iranian state-sponsored hacktivism, which includes DDoS attacks, defacement attacks, hack and leak attacks, and wiper attacks. These attacks create an array of business disruptions with the potential for financial loss as well. This is particularly relevant for hack and leak and especially wiper attacks, which can lead to long-term disruptions. Next, we discussed Iranian state-sponsored cyber espionage and intelligence gathering. While these attacks aren't as closely linked to business disruptions, they can compromise sensitive information, ranging from intellectual property to strategic data to personal information. A lot of these attacks culminate in account takeover and support Iranian government objectives. Additionally, the exposure of personal information can enable long-term social engineering and also follow-on operations. And finally, we discussed third-party attacks and how they can directly or indirectly impact your organization through business disruptions, data compromise, and credential reuse. Next slide. And part of the so what element is also what UltraViolet is doing to protect our clients. So the now colorful MITRE heat map on the right shows the frequency of TTPs observed across the threat groups we discussed today, with those shaded in green being the most commonly observed TTPs. UltraViolet has enabled a number of detections against behaviors commonly observed across Iranian threat actors, including those we discussed today and more. These detections cover identity behavior, across the infection chain and allow us to respond to these threats before you feel the impacts that we talked about throughout today's session. And just in case I stumbled there a little bit, these detections identify behavior. They do not explicitly cover identity behavior. We can go to the next slide. Along with what we're doing are steps that your organization can take today. And I should clarify this expands beyond the third-party remediations we discussed earlier. A lot of the initial access techniques we see across Iranian threat actors are tried and true social engineering techniques. If you're not already, ensure your employees are aware of these threats, not just standard phishing, as that's no longer the world we live in, and make sure they have a clearly defined and user-friendly way to report social engineering threats as they appear. Also, be sure to implement regular internal social engineering trainings and consider implementing some of the techniques we discussed today into these trainings as part of your tests. I like to say that our employees are the front lines, and it's true, so we need to make sure that they're prepared to respond. We already discussed the vendor collaboration, so I'll skip over that, but specific to Iran, block inbound connections from Iranian IPs at the perimeter, and the same goes for Starlink IPs. If for some reason there's a critical business need for one reason or another, then implement conditional access controls for these IPs. And because a lot of Iranian threat actors pursue account takeover, make sure that you increase your monitoring for suspicious logins, including login attempts outside work hours or impossible travel. If you're not familiar with impossible travel, it is physically impossible to log in from New York and then from Tehran an hour later. So keep an eye out for that behavior. And finally, I've linked Tide's recent advisory on Iranian threat actors for anyone who's to review as they wish. And also be sure that you connect with your UV cyber team for additional intel and best practices. This, again, is an evolving situation, and we are happy to stay on top of it for you. Next slide. So we covered this in the last few slides, so I'm not going to repeat everything again. This is more of a slide for you to screenshot or go back to and refer to as you wish. Internally, we can get these slides sent out as a PDF, which would also handle the link for the Iranian threat advisory that I discussed on the last slide. Obviously, you can't click into that through a webinar. But I'll leave this up for a minute in case anyone wants to just review anything or take a screenshot. And then from there, we can move into our question and answer section. Kathleen, if you want to go forward to the last slide for me.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
If there's any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. I have one to start that came up. This one, does Iran have more state-sponsored actors than the groups covered today?
Yep, so absolutely, and quite a few actually, probably far more than we could ever cover in one session. But just to name a few, Agrius is another group linked to the MOIS that engages in state-sponsored hacktivist activity in the form of ransomware and wiper attacks. They primarily target Israeli and Middle Eastern organizations, which is why they weren't part of our deck today. There's also, just to name a few, APT39, which is also linked to MOIS, Oil Rig, Cleaver, Copy Kittens, Fox Kitten. They have a good number.
Any other questions? You can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or we could do, you could throw it in the chat. So while we wait, there was another question about when you mentioned the use of AI for the smishing messages that you showed on that one slide. Can you expand into some of the other ways that threat actors are using AI in that kind of way?
Absolutely. That's actually fitting timing. We actually Tide released a report today. You can find it on the UV website. That report covered dark AI, which is AI abuse, and shadow AI, which is unapproved AI use. The Tide report is pretty in depth. I would definitely recommend taking a look. it would probably take a lot more time than we have to cover this entirely. But there are a number of ways that we are seeing threat actors weaponize AI. There's the very simple way which we covered today, which is using AI to increase the realism of phishing messages. But then at a high level, there's also deep fake campaigns, automated attack chains, again, shadow AI, which is really, if you think about it, or to I guess explain it more, would be the unsanctioned use of AI tools. Now that's going to risk endpoint exposure, but it's not necessarily someone trying to abuse AI. Again, there's also some indirect, maybe overlooked ways that AI is being weaponized. So, for example, one common method that we saw really at the advent of ChatGPT was malvertising or fake downloads for fraudulent AI tools. So at that time, ChatGPT did not have a desktop app, but there were a number of malvertising sites advertising a desktop app, and those sites ultimately led to malware, typically an info stealer. It's also been reported that state-sponsored APTs will leverage LLMs to more efficiently sort through their exfiltrated data. So if you think about APT 33, APT 35, some of those groups that we talked about today that maybe aren't having that immediate business impact, but they are exfiltrating massive volumes of data. Someone at some point has to search through that data, and some state-sponsored actors have found it efficient to leverage LLMs to make that process easier.
All right, we have another question in the chat. Much of these attacks seem opportunistic, random. Is there any sense of intercooperation between the groups launching targeted attacks? And if so, what are they focusing on?
It's certainly possible that there's collaboration. It's not necessarily something that we would have direct information to. That might be something that needs to go through, say, the FBI or CIA or NSA, for example. But there is evidence of state-sponsored actors across the board working together. There is evidence of some Iranian state-sponsored actors working together. If we look back at some of the hacktivist actors, for example, they're going to be not necessarily opportunistic, but I would hesitate of saying fully targeted. They're going to look maybe more opportunistically at a set scope of organizations. So organizations that might tick the Israeli-built technologies has been a big one. Any sort of organizations that might have some symbolic meaning if they were to target them. For the state-sponsored activity, that's where we will see more of a targeted approach, although with Iranian threat groups, especially the APT-33, as mentioned earlier, they do have a tendency to be more, we could say, more opportunistic in their original targeting or more just high volume in their original targeting, essentially trying to maximize the number of successful infections that they have. And then they will pursue the more high value targets from there. So that was the triage reference, if you will, that they will ensure that they have access to organizations, assess what type of organization they have access to, assess the privileges they have with their access, and proceed from there.